Now that we've talked a lot about demand, let's move to the other side of the picture and talk about supply. As you recall, the quantity supplied in a market is just the amount of a particular good or service that firms are willing to produce and sell. Just as with demand, the quantity supplied of an item depends on a number of different factors. The first and probably most fundamental determinant of supply is price. Just like we had with the law of demand, we have something called the law of supply. The law of supply states that, all else being equal, the quantity supplied of an item increases as the price of that item increases. Let's think about what that looks like on our supply curve. Again, just as with demand, our supply curve represents the relationship between the price of the item and the quantity supplied. We can either use a lowercase q to talk about individual firm supply, the amount supplied by one company, or we can use a capital Q to talk about market supply, which is just the amount produced by all of the firms in the market. You'll notice here that our supply curve slopes upward, which is consistent with what we said regarding the law of supply. Let's think about an example supply curve right here. We can say that the quantity supplied is equal to -4 plus 8p. Well, how would we graph this? When we had a demand curve, we had two different intercepts on our graph, and we said we'll just plot those intercepts and draw a line. Now with the supply curve, we really only have one intercept to speak of. But still, we might as well start there. You can say, this intercept here is the place where quantity supplied is equal to 0. So if we set quantity supplied equal to 0 and solve for price, we can see here that our price intercept is 1/2. What this means is that 1/2 is the minimum price required to get any firms to produce at all. A price is below that amount, we're just getting a quantity supplied of 0, or thinking more intuitively, no firms are entering that particular business. In order to draw our line more or less to scale, we have to have another point on our curve. So what we can do here is we can just plug in another value for quantity and solve for price, although it might be easier to just plug in a number for price and see what the quantity comes out to be. For example, if we plugged in a value of 1 for our price, then the quantity supplied is equal to -4 plus 8, which is 4. So we could say then that at a price of 1, our quantity supplied is going to be 4. We now have our 2 points and we can just connect the dots. You'll notice two features of the supply curve equation. The first is that the coefficient on price is greater than 0. Again, this is just consistent with the law of supply, stating all else being equal, as the price of the output goes up, firms want to produce more of that output. Here we can say that that's consistent with the slope of our supply curve being greater than 0. This tends to make sense because as the price of the output goes up, it becomes more appealing for firms to shift resources to producing that output. You can think of an example of leather shoes versus leather coats. If the price of leather shoes goes up, it's more appealing than it was before to produce leather shoes. There's going to be some shift of resources from producing coats to producing shoes instead, and the quantity supplied is going to go up. In this particular example, our supply curve has a slope of 1/8, because again, we say that slope is the change in price divided by the change in quantity. So if we plug in the 2 points that we used to draw our supply curve in the first place, we see that the price goes from 1/2 to 1, and the quantity goes from 0 to 4, giving us 1/2 divided by 4, which is 1/8. The other notable feature of our supply curve is that the constant in our equation is something that's less than 0. The reason that this is useful is because if our constant is less than 0, you'll notice that it requires a strictly positive price in order to get firms to actually supply anything. And in most cases, not all cases, but most cases, this is an intuitively reasonable concept. that if a firm wasn't getting a positive price for its output, why would it be bothering to produce that in the first place? One other thing to note about supply is that it represents the marginal cost of the firms in the market. And we say marginal cost is just the cost of producing one more unit of something, given that you're already at your current level of output. We're going to come back and talk about that more and say exactly why that's important, but it's just a concept that I wanted to introduce to you right away. The second determinant of supply is input prices. And by inputs we mean things like labor, materials, capital, rent, land, anything that goes into the manufacturing process for the item in question. We can say as input prices go up, it becomes more expensive to produce a particular item. If it becomes more expensive to produce the item, it becomes less attractive. If it becomes less attractive to produce an item, then the supply is going to decrease. Conversely, as input prices go down, it becomes cheaper to produce an item. Well, if it becomes cheaper, it becomes more attractive to produce, and firms are going to want to produce more of that item. The third determinant of supply is technology. Now, when we talk about technology in this context, we're actually using a broader definition of technology than one you probably think about when you're just engaging in normal conversation. In an economic sense, when we talk about technology, we just refer to the process by which inputs are converted to output. In this sense, as we say that technology increases in a given market, it just means that firms are able to produce more output than they could before with a given level of input. If technology were to decrease in a market, it means that firms are now able to produce less output than they were before, with a given level of input. Alternatively, you could think about an increase in technology as a situation where firms could produce as much as they could before with fewer inputs, and you could think of a decrease in technology as a firm needing more input than it did before to produce a given level of output. So let's think about how this affects supply. Well, if we have an increase in technology, then we're getting more output for a given level of input, becomes more attractive to produce, and we want to produce more, therefore our supply goes up. With a decrease in technology, with a given level of input we can produce less than we could before, it becomes less attractive to produce, and our supply decreases. Now, of course, you can think about technology in a literal sense, meaning just how efficiently can you produce, but it also takes into account a number of situations such as weather. You could think about a case where bad weather destroys part of an agricultural crop, for example. Well, given the particular level of input that was put into growing that crop, we get less output than we did before because of the inclement weather. In economic terms, this counts as a decrease in technology, and we would see a decrease in supply as a result. Just like with demand, expectations play a role in determining the quantity supplied of a given item. And we can say here that we can have expectation regarding future prices, future input prices, future technology, etc. It's unclear in this sense and has to go on a case-by-case basis which direction the different effects go, but just remember that expectations do play a role in determining today's supply. The last determinant of supply, while not relevant for individual firm supply, is relevant for market supply, and that's simply the number of sellers in the market. And we say that as the number of sellers in a particular market increases, our supply increases. And as the number of sellers in a market decreases, our supply decreases.